Russian army is committing barbaric actions.
Welcome to the seventh lecture in our Understanding the War series. And today I'll be talking about the United States of America, the US. And once again, I'll do it with an introduction. And then I will say, number one, a few thoughts and ideas about the past. Second, about the present. And third, about the future of the United States, and especially as it links to security policy and commitment basically to European security. Now, by way of introduction, I should basically come out of the closet, be open with you. I'm an avid transatlanticist. I've spent a year as a young exchange student at the age of 17 in the United States, and I also did my undergraduate work at Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina, and those were very much formative years for me. So in that sense, I'm very much a child of the end of the Cold War, because I started studying in the US in 1989, and I remember watching the dismantling of the shackles of communism in Eastern and Central Europe, and I remember watching speeches by Reagan, also actually by Thatcher, by Helmut Kohl, by Gorbachev, about the virtues of freedom. So my take is probably going to be, for all intents and purposes, quite, if I may, pro-American. I should also tell you that one of the most shaping experiences that I had with US foreign policy cooperation was not when I was a young trainee at the Finnish embassy in Washington, D.C. in 1992, but when I mediated peace in Georgia in 2008, and I worked very closely with then Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice and Undersec Dan Fried. So here we go. Number one, a few points about the past and American engagement. Now, I think it's quite safe to say that the United States, basically since World War II, even earlier, has been the bedrock of European security. And this is obviously linked not only to the Marshall Plan, which the Americans drove in the post-war era, also to its establishment of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in 1949. It's also linked to the Bretton Woods system, including the IMF and the World Bank, its strong support for the creation of the European Union, and then of course its military presence in Europe during the Cold War and actually after the Cold War as well. Now, as any relationship, the US-Europe relationship was always and has always been based both on interests and on values. So on the interest side, we're basically talking about power, security, and wealth. It was always in the interest of the United States to have a strong, prosperous, and peaceful Europe, which was also at the same time a repellent to the Soviet communist system of governance during the Cold War. Now, on the value side, there was always this sort of very close connection and link between the two of us, and it was obviously based on the idea of liberal democracy, the idea of capitalism or market economy, if you want to use a softer term, and also this notion of freedom. So there was always this sort of really good and solid and fairly comfortable balance, I would argue, between Europe and the United States. Now, this obviously in the past didn't mean that the Americans were always engaged in European security. I mean, there was always this sentiment of disengagement, and you have to understand that the United States in many ways is an island, protected by the Pacific and protected by the Atlantic. So naturally, geographically, it's in its interests to be isolationist and basically stay away. But because of its own security interest, it actually wasn't that. Yes, in the beginning of World War I it was, and yes, in the beginning of World War II it was, but then at the end of the day it engaged, and you could say that pretty much the US dominated the 20th century, and part of that domination was its very close link to Europe and the European Union. So the past has been, a good relationship, obviously, and I'm looking at the past at about 100 years between the US and Europe. Now, my second point is then about the present, and let me begin the present with 1989, and I know it feels quite far away, but it's actually quite close. So if you think about that time, we had just come out of the Cold War. The Soviet Union hadn't collapsed yet. It collapsed in August 1991, but the direction was pretty clear. So we had moved from a bipolar world, the Soviet Union and the United States, both with their allies, either forced or not, to a unipolar world where you could argue that the undisputed superpower of the world at the time was the United States. And this was just at the tail end of Ronald Reagan, at the beginning of George Bush, the senior, if you will. And there was this sentiment that, okay, we're witnessing the end of history. The United States won the Cold War, and the rest of the world is now going to start to follow the US. But I think this was the moment when we also sort of didn't realize that, well, perhaps the United States didn't want to be 100% engaged in the rest of the world and wanted to start looking perhaps even a little bit inwards. And if there ever was a clear American domination, which I do argue that there was in the 1990s, this started to slowly wither away. And I would give you 3 dates where I believe that American engagement, or at least, how would I say, American global authority started to reduce. The first one was 9/11. So there was an understanding that actually for the first time in the history of NATO, a NATO country is attacked, the Twin Towers, in September 2001. And there was this thinking that perhaps we're moving towards a world where not everyone appreciates American hegemony. Not everyone appreciates, accepts, or respects the way in which the United States wanted to run the world. Now, this was bubbling around, and there was a lot of talking about emergence of others, about BRICS, in other words, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, many others. But to a certain extent, it took a few years for the rest of the world to understand the wars in Iraq, wars in Afghanistan, Libya, etc., that this sort of American hegemony wasn't really accepted anymore. The system problem came actually in 2008 when we saw the beginning of the financial crisis, which obviously started in in September 2008 with the collapse of one of the biggest investment banks in the world, namely Lehman Brothers. And this sort of became a burden for the US because we could see that the financial markets, if not regulated, would lead to a subprime crisis, as we saw in the US, which then obviously spilt over to a global financial crisis with ramifications, for instance, in Europe, with the form of a financial crisis and later a euro crisis. The nail to the coffin of what I would call straightforward American dominance or unilateralism or unipolarity happened with the election of Donald Trump in 2016, when the US had slowly started to be a little bit more disengaged, perhaps during not during Clinton, not necessarily during George W. Bush either, but started slowly to happen during Obama. And then when 2016, when Donald Trump was elected, then there was no question anymore. Even the rhetoric was very much about, well, let's make America great again. At the same time, America first. There was disengagement, obviously, from NATO. I'll get back to that in just a second. And also there was this sort of end of a Cold War era, in the sense that I think Donald Trump was a lot more comfortable actually with with Putin and Russia and this sort of, how would I say, macho man, hard politics and global politics. And there was this sort of, fear in Europe that what's going on here. This fear, to a certain extent, led even French President Emmanuel Macron to talk about a brain-dead NATO. Donald Trump was saying, not withdrawing from NATO, but saying that, listen, you need to pay as well, and wasn't really sort of that engaged with NATO. So these three things, 9/11, 2008, the financial crisis, and then the election of Donald Trump, sort of got us all to believe that we're moving towards the United States, which is very much America first. And at the same time, in the US, there was this pivot towards China and a Pacific partnerships. And some Europeans started to feel a little bit edgy that, what's going on here? We have this wonderful transatlantic partnership, and is it withering away? So that's basically the present, or put it this way, I'd say from 1989 to the 24th of February 2022. Now, here we come to the third and final part, in other words, the future. If there's a silver lining to the war in Ukraine, or the attack of Russia to Ukraine, it is that the transatlantic partnership is back with a vengeance. I still remember when I was foreign minister and Hillary Clinton and Sergei Lavrov pressing the reset button and saying, our relationship, Russia, the US, is back. And I actually thought this is a good thing. I think there was a spelling mistake, by the way, in Russian on that reset button, but that's beside the point, but a little bit symbolic. I also tried, when I was foreign minister, to rejuvenate the transatlantic partnership with a few speeches here and there about how important it is to renew our marriage vows, if you will. But to be honest, it didn't happen until February this year. I'm reminded of the type of a relationship that the United States and Europe had during the Cold War, when I observed the reactions and actions on sanctions, on joint meetings, on solidarity, on financial assistance, on armaments assistance. So there was immediately this sentiment that, we're looking at a transatlantic partnership 2.0. And obviously, as an avid transatlanticist, I welcome this. I mean, the reasons for it are tragic. I fully admit that. And to a certain extent, the reasons are a little bit old school as well, in the sense that we are witnessing the emergence of a new Iron Curtain, where on one side of the curtain you will have an isolated, aggressive and revisionist Russia, and on the other side of the curtain you will have 40 European states, starting from, say, Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine, all the way to the British Isles, and then the United States and obviously Canada, with flank support from other allies around the world, the likes of Japan, South Korea, New Zealand and Australia. It's also interesting to see timing-wise, if 2016 was a bit of a closing the door of the transatlantic partnership, 2021 or 2020 and the election of Biden, and then Secretary of State Blinken has clearly showed that we've gone to the good old times. So you basically have two veterans of transatlantic partnership coming together. But is this going to last? Well, we saw the United States starting to bubble with the election of Trump. And by starting to bubble, I mean to say that we were looking at a very divided society with the haves and the have-nots, and a very strong political rhetoric and division between Democrats and Republicans, or new school Democrats and old school Republicans, or new school Republicans and old school Democrats. So it was a very divided society. And the thing here is that as much as I want to see the transatlantic partnership as close as it has been during the past few months, we should be realistic and understand that the United States has midterm elections coming up. We'd have to see what kind of election results we get from there. We're looking at presidential elections a couple of years from now. So if the focus is on the transatlantic partnership and the war at the moment, it probably is not going to be that during the elections. It's going to be more about the price of a gallon of gas, as they say in the US, at the pump. It's going to be about inflation, because you quite rarely win elections on foreign policy or vowing eternal love to Europe. So right now the transatlantic partnership is very strong and it feels good, but expect it not to last as intimate as it is now, but it will be much stronger than we expected it to be only a few months back. So let me then conclude by saying that, number one, I'm a little bit concerned about the global power balance. And in one of our next lectures, we'll talk about how the rest of the world has reacted to this conflict, which is not only about Russia versus the West. So we're going to have to start thinking a little bit about what the world order looks like, and we're going to do that in a few of our later episodes. But obviously the United States and the partnership that the United States and Europe have on this, which is value-based and interest-based, is going to be extremely important. Now, secondly, you don't have to be Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote a fantastic book on American democracy, to understand that the United States has a very strong economy, but at the same time, quite a weak infrastructure. And if it doesn't start getting the balance right between a growing and strong economy and a weak infrastructure, and at the same time a divided political class, I think we're going to see a lot of domestic problems in the United States, which then have a ramification to foreign policy and to its relationship with Europe. My third and final point is to say that the US at the moment is a divided society. We saw that during the previous elections, but it's a divided society both economically and politically. Now, the good news is that America actually has extremely strong and resilient democratic institutions. We saw that, in the presidential elections between George W. Bush and Al Gore, and the institutional conflict that took place on the votes in Florida. We saw that also when the democratic institutions were violently attacked by Donald Trump after the last elections. They actually survive. But what the rest of the world needs to understand is that, the US has elections in 2 years, and we simply don't know whether the footnote of history is Joe Biden or someone like him, or Donald Trump and someone like him. So, coming back, the United States will remain the backbone of European security. A strong transatlantic partnership is extremely important for all of those, including myself, that believe in liberal Western values. How long this is going to last, I don't know, but if you look at it from the European perspective, America is back.
Over the last 30 years, the forces of autocracy have been
The Russian army